Chapter 4, Lecture C.
Happy Friday the 13th. I hope you all are having a spectacular day. I love Friday the 13th. We spent half the day in my classes going through some various urban legends and stuff, so I hope you have had the same opportunity throughout your day. Not very often do you get a full moon on a Friday the 13th with a harvest moon combined, so everything's kind of crazy. So talking about that, we're going to talk about religion, which fits pretty well with the topic for today. We're going to talk about the Great Awakening, and then we're going to get into the battle for the continent. So Chapter 4, Great Awakening. Religion remained central to 18th century American religious revivals. Ministers were concerned church engagement were falling because of the Enlightenment, rationalism, commercial development, vice, westward expansion, and lack of individual engagement. The other thing is, you have a parish priest or a preacher or anything, they had to travel several miles to really even get enter any action with congregations because they were so far away. So, that being said, this sprung up a series of rivals in the 1730s to counteract the Enlightenment, church enrollment, and such. So they're going to have pastors that are going to kind of try to get more excited about things. It's also known as the Great Awakening for this period. 18th century witnessed a revival of religious fundamentalism in many parts of the world, reform and revival even in the Islam in the Middle East. So you're not just going to be limited to Christianity. Jonathan Edwards, one of the most famous of these individuals, pioneered an intensely emotional style of preaching. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. You're going to see a preacher that's very passionate, very loud, kind of more of a Baptist sermon by today's standards probably, but much more passionate. They're going to have these large outside meetings trying to get people excited about religion again. Now, the preaching of Whitefield, George Whitefield traveled from England to the colonies in 1739 and preached mercy rather than predestination for damnation. Could be saved if you repented of sins. More personal, not much as, you're already predetermined to go to hell or heaven. Became a celebrity and his events attracted large crowds. Kind of similar to Jonathan Edwards. Other evangelists followed after he left, but the point of this is in the 1730s and the 40s right here, they're in this age of the Great Awakening. You're going to have a religious revival. And that's really what's important here to understand. And it's going to be a counter-reaction to the Enlightenment, logic, reason, and science. So as often as it goes, there was a counter-reaction to an event that was going on. The impact of the Awakening, numerous dissenting churches, old lights and new lights in the Congregational Church. To understand what the Congregational Church was, is simply that was the Puritan Church, the Pilgrim Church. The old lights were the people that kind of wanted to keep with the old traditions. They were the old church members, the ones that were destined to be saved and all that. The new lights who were saved by their relatives that were maybe not direct descendants far as, like a father, son, or like an aunt, cousin, or whatever. Plus the Congregational Church, the Puritan Church was having problem with membership because, they were deeming too many people weren't saved and such. Some preachers will attack slavery as wrong, though it's not the majority. Attack commercial success and elites for control. Planting the seed of social reform or freedom in many ways. So the Great Awakening is not just going to be geared towards spiritual revival, but it's going to be looking at commercial vices, spending money, on slavery a little bit, but it's going to plant some new notions of freedom in society. Now, imperial rivalries. Spanish in North America. Spain controlled a vast area of land from Florida to the southwest of North America, Louisiana Territory as we call it today, or the American Southwest and the Central Plains. Troubles attracting settlers, the Spanish, and then later the French could not get people to move there for various reasons, mostly Indians and remoteness. Indians outnumbered them all and adopted a much better policy of the Indians, though the Indians were not necessarily aggressive towards the Spanish. In those large remote areas, it was still difficult to control. Due to conflicts in other European countries, could never meet the military demands on the frontier. Thus, it was not a very popular place for Spanish to be. Now, California will be one of the most successful areas they'll have. Russians actually tried to take control of the Pacific Northwest down through Alaska. Spain launched, but that will not be overly successful. Spain will launch the sacred experiment. Eventually turned to Franciscan monks to convert Indians and help set up ranching and other farming activities, though they are still heavily outnumbered by natives. Now, also presidios, military posts dotted the California landscape with missions. Basically, the military post would be right there in unison with one of the monks. Native population took a downfall when settlers arrived, for mostly because of diseases. Mexican won its independence from Spain By 1821 in Spain, Spanish rule also came to an end in California later on. But the point of this is you're going to see that the Spanish never in North America have a firm grasp on the territory. It's always going to be very loose and very hard to manage. Though South America, in Mexico, that area, they did have a strong control for many, many years. The North American portion, or just north of Mexico, is going to be hard for them to hold. The French Empire, France was a greater rival to the British than the Spanish. Controlled much of modern-day Canada and pushed down the Mississippi River Valley, going on to the British lands that had already, quote-unquote, been spoken for. But what you're going to see is the French and the British are moving towards that central part of the United States, or near the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi area, and that's where they're going to ultimately lead into conflict. They will found the city of New Orleans in 1718. Now that's at the opposite end of the spectrum, down in the Gulf of Mexico. But you can see the French are definitely trying to expand their empire and trying to take as much away from the British as they can. Still hard to attract settlers due to the idea of being a cruel place for exiles and criminals. The point of this, though, is the French are going to have a better footprint in North America than the Spanish will, at least in Canada down through the rivers. Battle for the continent. This is going to lead us into our last section for Chapter 4. Ohio River Valley became a middle ground, borderland where many different groups of people meet. Indians in this area learned to play the European powers on each other. Basically, the Indians are like, hey, if we get them fighting, it benefits us, and they avoid confrontation with us. Many prominent colonists wanted to establish a new empire in the world, or in the West. The Ohio Company, set up in 1749, was granted a land grant of 500,000 acres. This angered the French and bolstered their presence in the region. This helped lead to what we know as the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War in America. 7 Years' War, as it's known overseas, British had already, by the 1750s, had a large empire around the world. In 1754, the British tried to kick out the French in that Ohio River area. A young George Washington led a failed mission in which he was forced to surrender. The first years, the British were... So basically, how this war is going to kick off is the French build a fort, or in an area of the Ohio River Valley that the British claim. They send young Lieutenant Washington out there, or captain, he might have been a captain by that point, to basically say leave. Washington goes out there. He doesn't speak French. The French say no. There's some fighting that goes on. Washington builds Fort Necessity, surrendered. It's pouring down rain. One of the worst tactical things he could ever have done. He's forced to surrender, and they acknowledge that this was French land. It was his fault and all this. And there's also in Washington's career, if you study it, he may or may not have had an Indian executed and all this, which there's a lot of debate about it. The point of this is this kicks off a major conflict between the French and the British. The first years, the British were badly defeated by the French. The frontier was set ablaze. The French were far more prepared for this type of conflict initially. By 1757, things began to change when Secretary of State William Pitt, who changed the British way of funding and fighting the war, basically running a deficit and taxation, and also put competent leaders finally in, the British will emerge victorious by 1763. And the other thing is Washington's not a one and done in this. He actually comes back, makes a name for himself. Not necessarily makes names for himself, but he redeems himself a little bit. But ultimately, other British generals do not listen to him because of his initial failure, because he understands this guerrilla warfare where the French and the Indians are hiding. Ironically enough, this is a tactic that the Americans will use later on in the Revolution or War of Independence. Now, world transform. And if you take the time in the PowerPoint that is posted on the site, you will have a good video from Crash Course that goes through that. Now, the world transformed. The British gained Canada, gave back a few sugar islands to the French, but the point of this is the French are pretty much kicked out of North America now for good. Spain ceded Florida to the British in exchange for Cuba and the Philippines. Spain will take control of the vast Louisiana colony. So basically, the French lose everything. The French lost their 200 years of old empire in North America. The debt from this war would help pave the way for the French Revolution. They took a pretty heavy loss from this. Also, the American Revolution or War of Independence will do that as well. The British also looked to tax the colonies to help cover the cost of the war. Now, Pontiac's Rebellion launched against the British after the French and Indian War, partly influenced by the teaching of Neilon, or a Delaware religious prophet. The whole idea was to drive out the British, return to the old ways, and reject European technology. Pontiac, in short, was a traditionalist by the sense of the Indians. Now, this is going to lead to a couple things. Though Pontiac's rebellion will fail, it does have some consequences. The proclamation line of 1763 will be put out after peace is made in this rebellion. The king, I think, actually, London issues this, but I think the king kind of was behind this, prohibiting the further colonization west of the Appalachian Mountains. You got to stay east. The whole point of this was colonists kept going west, interacting with the Indians, thus resulting in conflict. The king and the British Empire are like, hey, quit this. We can't afford these wars right now. Aim was to stabilize the frontier and Indian relations. Angered the colonists, and this is going to set off just general discontent towards the British. Including George Washington, who bought Indian lands in the West. This was deemed as an overreach, not right, etc. By the end of the day, this will fail miserably because the colonists just simply ignore it. Pennsylvania and the Indians finally ended the peaceful relationship with the Indians of Pennsylvania. Quakers opposed all conflict and resigned in protest as war with the Indians started to mount. Thus, they lost control in the assemblies, and the Quakers who had controlled Pennsylvania from its inception now will lose control and the ability to have positive policies towards Indians. Now, colonial identities. Before the war, the colonies were largely isolated from one another. Now they are going to start to merge into more interactions. Franklin had drafted in 1754 Albany Plan of Union to try and unite the colonies. It failed, but it set in motion the potential for the colonies actually to unify. The war created tighter bonds with the colonies, and even with the British Empire, now the colonies are actually more vested in the empire than they've ever been. This happy victory would soon change to transform all colonies and ultimately lead to the British saying, hey, you need to pay your part to be part of the empire. Thus, as we come to the end of chapter 4 here, you're seeing now we're on the cusp or the verge of the 1760s in which the colonies will finally be forced to take their stance within the empire, but in one where they have to pay, not just be there coming along for a ride. So chapter 1 through 4, units 1 through 4, we have covered the early colonization or the immigration initially of people to the New World from Europe. We've talked about the colonies that were created by the Spanish, French, and later English. We've talked about various wars. We've talked about specifically the American colonies that will be founded, specifically the 13. And now we're getting to the point of where there's conflict over those groups of people. And we've talked about the political ideology that they formed the new colonies under and the things that they influenced them. And now we're going to arrive finally at a point that many of you will know or have some basic knowledge of, and that's the American Revolution followed by the American War of Independence. Two separate things that often get lumped into one, and I even myself say them into one. Anyway, this concludes chapters 1 through 4 of the book and the material for this course. Have a wonderful Friday the 13th.
Okay, one of the questions